Then I'll share my screen and we can get underway. So welcome everyone who's joined us. As you can see, tonight's program, a Massachusetts Peace Action webinar is Twin Existential Threats. What are the obstacles to a mass movement and how do we overcome them? We have some fantastic speakers to help us answer the question. And with that, I would like to welcome everyone and hand it over to our fabulous organizer, Kathy.
Hello, everybody. I am Kathy Malley Morrison. I'm the chair of the Twin Existential Threat campaign, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you here today. And I'm very happy also to immediately turn over the meeting to our coordinator, Claire. Claire, would you take over? And Claire, please unmute.
Sorry about that. Hello, everybody. I'm Claire Schaeffer-Duffy, and I'm Program Director at Worcester's Center for Nonviolent Solutions. And I'm also a board member of Mass Peace Action. As Kathy said, as Brian said, this evening's event is going to focus on the twin existential threats of nuclear war and the climate crisis. And if you are like me, the very phrase existential threat evokes inner resistance. Existential threat is such a big phrase. Who wants to think about that? And yet these are realities that we have to face in order to change them. So we're going to look tonight at what stokes that resistance, the psychological obstacles, the social and the practical ones. And to help us do that, we have three esteemed panelists to share their wisdom. They are going to speak at the top of the evening. I will introduce each one before they speak. They'll speak for about 8 minutes. And then that will be followed by a 15-minute period where they can have exchange among themselves. And we will also take questions from the audience. And we ask that if you could please put your questions in the Q&A and rather than in the chat box, because it will be a little bit easier to keep track of that. And after that portion of the evening, then we're going to go into breakout rooms and spend a little time in small groups responding to what we've heard. The organizers who have worked so hard to put this together are really eager to animate action from all of you. So that is the intention of hearing from our speakers, not to be passive, but to see how to become more engaged in efforts to address the climate crisis and the threat of nuclear war. And then after that, we'll have short report backs from the groups, and Dan Shaw is going to close us out. We'll provide you with at least one opportunity during the webinar this evening to take action. So I think before we start with our speakers that we are going to see a brief video, is that correct? And hear from Louise.
But first we see the ad, right,
Yep,
Brian?
that's correct. I just need to change my screen, so just bear with me for one moment.
Sure.
Thank you, Claire. Just give me one.
So we'll talk about this after we see the ad, so people will understand what it is.
Yeah, but if you'd be so kind, Louise, how about you intro it just a little bit?
Okay. Right now? Right now. Okay. Well, my name is Louise Coleman. I'm the press liaison for Massachusetts Peace Action. And the DAISY ad was made in 1984. It was made by the LBJ presidential campaign. And it was so, it reverberated so much. It was so impactful that it has only been shown on TV once. It is in the Library of Congress, and every once in a while someone remembers it and goes back to see it. But it's a very impactful statement about why we really need to pay attention to how to stop nuclear weapons. And that was back in 1984. Things are much worse now. There's trillions spent on nuclear weapons, and we have to take action and stop it.
One, two, three, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Okay. Well, I first saw the DAISY ad back in the 80s when I first joined Massachusetts Peace Action. And that was what basically made me aware, and I never forgot it. So it's, and I've always been interested in trying to get into the media, into the press, the danger about nuclear weapons. And it's really hard because nobody wants to talk about nuclear weapons, but it's absolutely essential to do that. So the request, part of the request for this webinar tonight is to have people think about the DAISY ad and the fact that it really is a possibility for absolutely sure, more so now, even now than it was back then, and that if we take action, then we could stop it. It's not something that has to happen, but if we don't stop it, it will happen. And that it's just really essential that we use all of our organizing, all of our combined skills to have that happen. And one thing that people could do is Brian has a very active letters to the editor committee, and there's other possibilities in Mass Peace Action and the Back from the Brink program to work on how to make this not happen. But the absolute certainty is that our luck is going to run out, that it's not going to be able to keep going, and that to hear a US president do the countdown and in that LBJ resonating voice was I think essential back then in getting anti-nuke sentiment going, and we have to start it all over again. So I'm really glad we're having this webinar. We have great speakers who are going to talk about what can happen. I mean, the important thing I think is to wake up, to realize what could happen, but then to use this opportunity tonight to realize it doesn't have to happen. And that I'm available to anybody who wants to have any help with letters to the editor or any other way to get this message out. The Oppenheimer movie is a big help these days, but whatever works is what we have to do. Any questions? We're going to put the link to the DAISY ad in so people can use it if they want to.
Sure, I'll put that link in. Thanks, Louise.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Louise. And now we'll move to our first speaker, who is Dr. Joseph McCabe. Dr. McCabe is a graduate of Harvard Medical School, a psychiatrist, and a physician for psychological health. He helps with the psychological well-being of men and women, is a board member of Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. And as a psychiatrist, he's had to learn to make himself heard and understood by his patients to help them understand their illnesses and get the necessary treatment. Similarly, he's had to learn how to make himself heard and understood when talking about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of prevention as the only cure. So please, the microphone to Dr. McCabe.
Good evening. Thanks. I'm going to focus in my remarks on psychological obstacles to building a mass movement to deal with the twin existential threats. The original idea in planning this panel was to focus on how to deal with psychic numbing. I was an obvious choice to speak since I'm a psychiatrist and have been active in an anti-nuclear movement. It became clear, however, as we planned the event, that there's a lot more getting in the way of engaging people than psychic numbing. I'm going to cover 4 topics: psychic numbing, how our brains are wired that works against confronting these existential problems, deeply rooted human psychological responses that get us into trouble, and psychological support for the activists. The term psychic numbing was introduced by a psychiatrist, Robert J. Lifton, to describe the immediate response of the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the blasts. Psychic numbing is a generalized loss of emotional responses after an extreme trauma. The concept has been extended to a response to graphic depictions of the consequences of detonation of a nuclear blast, a sort of vicarious psychic numbing. The diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, include the symptoms of psychic numbing. Dr. Lifton introduced the concept prior to the addition of PTSD in 1980 to the standard list of psychiatric diagnoses. Are we in danger of inducing a state of paralyzing psychic numbing by even talking about the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons or the consequences of escalating global warming, both of which could lead to eventual mass extinction? In the late 1970s, a child psychiatrist, Rita Rogers, asked people about their response to the danger of nuclear weapons, just random people. She found that the responses were not the usual psychological defenses. Rather, the response was nothing. The nuclear threat created a feeling of bland, non-participatory aloofness. I maintain that this response is what will occur when people are presented with the horror without a course of action. One of the well-known pathways for recovery from PTSD is to engage in altruistic activity to prevent or lessen traumatic experiences for others. The 1983 made-for-TV film, The Day After, depicted scenes of extreme trauma following a full-scale nuclear war. It had a huge viewership and did not have a generalized numbing effect. Part of what may have helped people to respond with activism rather than numbing was that many people were able, in the early 1980s, largely because of the nuclear freeze movement and other anti-nuclear activism, to find ways to act effectively against a threat that was unimaginably painful to consider. Some of the Hibakusha, who clearly suffered acutely from psychic numbing, have been able, with the altruistic mission of warning the world of the destructiveness of nuclear weapons, to move beyond their PTSD. Second topic I'd like to discuss is that it's important to consider how the human brain is wired. Dr. Tina Duhaime, a Mass General neurosurgeon, has recently published a book, Minding the Climate, how neuroscience can help solve our environmental crisis. She writes that reward systems in both simple and complex organisms have evolved so that behaviors that increase the individual organism's chances of survival become more frequent. In other words, our brains are wired to respond to immediate threats and rewards. The cause and effect linkage between climate change and the behaviors that are necessary to respond are neither direct nor obvious. People can be confused about what to do to act ecologically. Dr. Duhaime gives the daunting prescription that to overcome our deficit in brain reward circuitry input, we will need to use our advanced powers of observation, pattern recognition, analytic capacity, future prediction, goal-directed problem solving, social connection, and communication to deal with the unprecedented problem of climate change. It's complicated. Dr. Duhaime suggests that interventions that encourage people to behave in ways that have positive environmental impact and presenting these behaviors as moral imperatives are more likely to result in pro-environmental behaviors than simply providing lists of things to do. Although Dr. Duhaime is focusing in her book on the environmental crisis, a similar prescription could be applied to motivate action to prevent nuclear war, since the risk of nuclear war seems distant to many people. She also points out that connecting to others through organizations provides ways for people to validate their shared commitment, sense of identity, and purpose to do the right thing. Third topic, I'd like to discuss 3 deeply rooted human psychological responses, which were written about and identified by a psychiatrist, Dr. Jerome Frank, in the 1982 American Psychiatric Association study, Psychosocial Aspects of Nuclear Developments. These psychological responses can be very hard to change, and they get in the way of effective action against the twin threats. One human response is the propensity to resort to violence when frightened or frustrated. Organizations like Mass Peace Action have been attempting to take on this response quite directly. A second human psychological response is the propensity to submit to authority. Questioning the status quo can be seen as disloyalty. I'll give some personal examples. The response of most of my town's select board members when confronted with my citizens' petition as a town meeting member to support Back from the Brink were things like this. It isn't our role to sort this out. We aren't experts in national defense. This is a national, not a town issue. This is none of our or your business.
Dr. McCabe,
Yes.
one minute. It's
Great.
wonderful what you're saying. I hate to even be the timekeeper,
I'm
but I
coming to the end. There are experts in national defense and experts in the military who are dealing with keeping us safe. The Back from the Brick resolution, by the way, eventually passed town meeting by a huge majority. The third psychological response is preserving the group. This is usually defined as a country, ethnic, or religious group. Our job is to convince people that the group at threat is humanity itself. The final psychological point I'll make is important that there be support for activists to avoid burnout. The same American Psychiatric Group in 1982 wrote, "We have found that it is essential to share this work with others, to work together in a group setting rather than to work alone, because of the awesomeness and terrible pain of the questions involved. The lack of informed public debate may well stem in part from how difficult it is for an individual alone to contemplate these extremely threatening issues. Thus, in working together through shared concern, we have found that we've been able to work at all." Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope we can go back and touch on all of those points when we're together. I'd like to welcome our second speaker, also a doctor, Dr. Joseph Hodgkin. He's an attending hospitalist physician at Massachusetts General Hospital and an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. Also a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and Back from the Brink. Dr. Hodgkins is involved in medical and peer education about the health effects of nuclear weapons. He lobbies for disarmament and de-escalatory nuclear policy and is in physician track 2 diplomacy to promote peace in the medical and scientific communities across the borders. So we will have a lot to learn from him.
Great, thank you so much. And Claire, please do cut me off if I run over here. So thank you so much to the organizers and the audience for coming. I think this is a great conversation. I want to recognize that I work primarily on the nuclear weapons side, so that's what I'll be talking about here, but there's a lot to learn from the case of climate change activism, which I think in many ways in the past few decades has sort of shown the way in building a mass movement. Also, my comments here are more reflective of my activist work than my clinical work. So the way I want to structure this a bit is ask some questions and use those to point in the direction of ideas for action. So my first question is what is the degree of public indifference on nuclear weapons and what is causing it? And you know, I did some looking in the literature, and there are a lot of surveys on particular, you know, what Americans think of particular policy issues, but studying this question of how interested are people in nuclear weapons and why may they or may not they be interested is there's not really as much evidence for. So I want to start by saying, you know, these are more anecdotal observations and speculations than based on research or anything like that. But I think this also points us in a first direction of action, which is if we had the resources and the time and the person power and the expertise, some research on this question would be very helpful. I think probably starting with qualitative projects, surveying people about their feelings about nuclear weapons. The next question I want to ask is what is missing from our movement? So I think social movements tend to function with a core of longitudinal devoted activists who work on the issue much of the time over time, and then a broader base in the community who are able to be activated when the zeitgeist turns to the topic. So people who may show up for protests and participate in actions when public focus turns to the topic. And I think we need more of both of these, both the devoted activists and the community. Those of us who are devoted activists, I think an important step is introspection, reflecting on what makes us unusual, what in our personal experience, family experience, and life brings us to this work, and think about how those unique features strengthen or impair our ability to communicate with non-activists. I think we need to be really self-reflective about that. And in the process of doing that work, we need to prioritize speaking to non-activists outside of the community. So it's great to have these conversations here together, but we need to make sure that we're talking to people who are not in this space. I also think that in terms of strengthening the activist core, presence in youth spaces is critically important because, you know, early 20s is the time when a lot of us kind of fix onto an issue that we want to work on. And I think Ira Helfand has done a lot of great work at Boston Latin with high school students. I work with medical students. I have a core group of medical students who I've worked with longitudinally in the US and Russia on these issues. So I think this is definitely also a priority. The next question I want to ask is how this moment is different from the 1980s, because as Louise and Joe have already alluded to, there was a massively successful grassroots movement in the 1980s that really turned the ship around and reversed Reagan and Gorbachev era policy on nuclear weapons. So I'm not entirely sure how this moment is different from the 1980s. I think it's complex and multifactorial. I want to invite the audience to think about that and raise this in our breakthrough groups. You know, there's certainly a lot more distance temporally from Hiroshima and the Cuban Missile Crisis now than there was. So I think that people may think of nuclear weapons as more of a fact of life than they did. I think there's also it seems there's also an important aspect of media fragmentation, that a media story, a perspective could be broadcast to everyone in American society in the 1980s, and now people get their news from Facebook and from TikTok, and it's much more fragmented and everyone's getting their own information sources. It occurs to me that it almost seems like the most shared mass media right now is shows on streaming services. And that sort of raises the question of how do we get a better storytelling out there. On the origin end, we need to make sure that we're doing the work collecting stories of those who are exposed to the nuclear weapons production and testing and use pipeline, as well as stories about what it would look like if nuclear weapons were used. So listening to the stories of those affected. And on the other end, somebody was alluding to the day after. It's critically important that we have the same kind of media that there was in the 1980s that was helping people imagine nuclear weapons. The day after threads, these were incredibly effective, as well as I think under-recognized the Terminator movie series. There's been a lot of discussion about Oppenheimer and how it fell short, but I think cultivating connections with those who are content creators and who have a foot in the door at Netflix and HBO would be an ideal approach here. So another important topic, another important question is, how do current political and economic conditions disempower action on existential threats? And I think this is a really important thing, that when much of the public are struggling for survival, that creates barriers to activism, and specifically barriers to activism on issues that don't feel like they're immediately impacting your life. And so I think, we have to recognize that the struggle for economic justice and successes on economic justice issues like basic income, minimum wage, universal health care, and debt relief can create the conditions for people to have the breathing room to work on existential issues that may not be directly impacting their lives, especially young people. And this also brings us to the imperative to build alliances with groups who support our work. And that means bi-directional showing up for each other, which we talked about at length in the preparatory meeting here. The last question I want to ask is, how do we amplify the voice of the activist core, whatever its size is, so that decision makers hear us? I just want to spotlight the strategy that we're using right now, the Back from the Brink movement, which is modeled on the nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s, where we have a nuclear weapons related policy platform, and we ask local communities and municipalities to endorse it, and that moves up through the state governments and the federal legislature. So we have a lot more information we can share about that. But I think that's a very good model for getting the voices of the activists to the very, very distant ears of the people actually making nuclear weapons decisions. Thank you.
Well, you did that under time. Did you have one more minute if you want to use it?
That's okay.
All right, so much to think about from both of these first speakers. So I really look forward to our conversation following the panelists. Our final panelist whom we'd like to welcome is Savina Martin. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Ms. Martin. She holds an honorary doctorate degree in humane letters and a Master of Science degree in human services. Ms. Martin is currently pursuing studies at Boston University School of Theology. She has a strong record of addressing poverty and inequality, has served as tri-chair of the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign and on the Advisory and Clergy Council of the National Union of the Homeless. She is an Army veteran, was honored with the prestigious Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Award in 1988. She serves as one of the revolving preachers at Freedom Church of the Poor, which is affiliated with the Cairo Center for Religious Rights and Social Justice in New York City. So we're looking so forward to your offering this evening, Ms. Martin.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting us and joining this esteemed panel. And also my colleagues who are here today, Janice Guzman and the wonderful Dr. M. Campbell, who we've worked with for many years. So I'm going to be really raw and try and get through this, keeping it, as I say, keeping it really real. So let me begin by acknowledging that we live on stolen land and that we experience threats of violence on a daily basis. And let me put on my minister's hat and say we also pray for the hope of a world free and liberated from poverty, racism, climate destruction, mass incarceration, and an end to chemical warfare and genocide in all of its forms. We continue to fight against the war on the poor, rumors of war, and we pray to liberate and awaken ourselves to win over good health, mind, body, soul, and planet. So this evening, I will speak from my perspective and experience as a Black woman living in the US, mobilizing in communities, faced with chemical warfare and a climate that is unpredictable, under-resourced, and overlooked. I recently read an article, and it was by Sage Howard, not on 9/23, and it was called Radioactive Waste Problems That Have Plagued This St. Louis Community. And the question was, where are the reparations? We pray for world repentance and reconciliation from the harms of humanity, threats seen and unseen, and the repair and demand for those reparations now. For centuries of existential threats from slavery, exploitation of labor, Jim and Jane Crow, the continued resurrection of evil and harm that besets our Black, Indigenous, and people of color here in the US and globally. I am not a medical doctor. However, I have been in the field, in the trenches for many years and have witnessed these atrocities firsthand. How do we overcome these barriers? And just what does existential threat mean? Do we dig deeper? Do we need another type of longitudinal observation? Do we need some more research? I don't know. I know one thing for sure: if communities had the access to treatment and care, I'm pretty sure that a lot of these barriers could be overcome. Existential threats mean it is used to describe a threat to actual living things as well as non-living things, such as a country or ideology. I'm asking you, an existential threat is a threat to a people's existence or survival? I can understand that. And does it have to be through nuclear destruction? We experience our own nuclear destruction every single day. In what ways, historically speaking, could we overcome some of these barriers, I ask? I've witnessed at the height of social upheavals, the historical three evils called fear, hypocrisy, and hatred. A quote by the late Dr. Howard Thurman, as he says, the three hounds of hell that trailed for centuries Black and Indigenous peoples. That phrase, the three hounds of hell, encapsulates Thurman's belief in the interconnectedness of these societal ills and the urgent need to address them collectively. By coining this phrase, Howard Thurman aimed to draw attention to the moral imperative of fighting against poverty, racism, and war, and to inspire individuals and communities to work toward a more just and peaceful world. Reconciliation, repair, and reparations. It may be steps to breaking the sound barriers to freedom ringing and liberation from various forms of systemic oppression. Let me help you see it. Disenfranchised communities often face systemic oppression, which poses that existential threat. The oppression includes racial discrimination, economic inequality, gender-based violence, and other forms of structural injustices. I'm sure you know this, but will you stand with us? It is not just a matter of inconvenience or hardship, but a fundamental threat to our dignity and rights. We have faced colonialism and enslavement. We have faced emancipation and Jim Crow, the civil rights movement. We have faced the Montgomery boycott. In these contemporary civil rights struggles, movements like Black Lives Matter protests, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, and the fight for Indigenous rights, and the relaunching of the Poor People's Campaign in 2018 is critical today that we join forces in this class struggle for human rights for all poor and low-wage people. We are fighting every day. We are activated in our own communities. We have joined the fight for climate change, health care, for toxicity, wastewaters, fighting for decent, clean, unleaded water in our communities. Will you stand with us? We work across all lines of division to win the fight for the third Reconstruction. In Massachusetts, there are more than 1,357,674 people, poor people, and low-income voters in Massachusetts. Indeed, the first governing principles of the U.S. Constitution is to establish justice, and we must fight poverty, not the poor. And I can go on and on. We could talk about peaceful protests, civil rights legislation, the urgent need for social justice advocacy. But will you stand with us? Social justice movements aim to counteract these threats by challenging systemic inequalities and advocating for legal and policy reforms and raising awareness about the unique challenges we face by marginalized communities.
Ms. Martin.
Lastly,
Okay.
I just want to say thank you all for having us here as we continue to fight economic deprivation, violence and discrimination, and all intersecting forms of oppression. After centuries of violence, we need to heal from centuries of harm.
Thank you so much. You've really given a deeper examination of existential threat and wonderful. So for this portion of the evening, we have, unfortunately, just 15 minutes, but let's use it well. This is your chance, panelists, to talk. If any ideas that each of you shared that provoke reflection, you're welcome to engage in that. And we also would like to take any questions from the audience. I am not seeing the chat box, the Q&A box, but while I look for that, please, panelists, if you had any additional remarks that you wanted to add or questions for each other.
Thank you. I think this is wonderful. I think we all took very different approaches to the prompt, which is awesome. And I think it was really fascinating to hear, Joe, your kind of deep dive into the psychology literature going back, and of course we know that Dr. Lifton is one of the founding doctors involved in the nuclear disarmament work, and he was there on the ground after Hiroshima. Savina, I very much appreciate the call to action and the challenge. And I think it is so important also for those of us who work on nuclear weapons to recognize and say out loud the numerous ways in which these issues intersect and interact. Not just the enormous diversion of resources to weapons that should be going to social uplift and healthcare and education and healing, but also the fact that these weapons disproportionately harm women and children, that they cause infertility and birth defects, that the entire production chain from uranium mining to plutonium processing to weapons testing has disproportionately targeted indigenous folks, people in Kazakhstan, Xinjiang, the American Southwest, Pacific Islands, and also recognizing that many of the strongest voices at the beginning of the nuclear age speaking out against nuclear weapons were Black activists, civil rights activists, and radicals. And that history is often sort of ignored or swept under the rug, but there's been some excellent writing about that on some of our platforms recently too. So I'm just grateful for the conversation and from hearing everyone's perspectives.
We have a question from Paul Poppenshock. Hello, Paul. He asks, what opportunities exist for collaboration between peace activists and climate activists to join in a mass movement for change? So you can each take an opportunity to respond to that. How about what do you see, Savina, for collaboration?
There are so many avenues and ways for us to collaborate. For one, I truly would like to see this type of conversation to be ongoing. The first step is the sharing of stories and building relationships, and then finding ways to support each other through this work and hearing both sides. And I think, Claire, you had said you had thanked me for taking a deeper dive. And that's what it's about. That is the first step for us coming together and looking at all sides of what's happening today in this climate. I just don't want to overlook our two colleagues who spent time coming here today and preparing. I just want to acknowledge Dr. M. Campbell again, who has been in the trenches, one of my great mentors for over 40 years, fighting against gun violence. And that is a strong part of militarism against these threats. And Janice Guzman, who is an organizer, a PCA with 1199, one of our major partners who have just won contracts. And I don't want to speak for them. They can speak for themselves. I just wish that we had a little bit more time, which we don't. We have to leave for a national meeting with the Poor People's Campaign right now, preparing for a large assembly happening in February. And I'm going to say this lastly, will you stand with us? We will need a lot of support, basically to hear from you as well. So stay tuned for that, but we'll make sure that information is given out.
Well, maybe go ahead, Dr. McCabe.
Yes, I think that the collaboration is extremely important because I was talking about what motivates people and what makes them become committed. And if we can somehow really clarify what Joe and you were talking about, that the people who are most injured by climate change are going to likely not be the richest people, and the people who have been most injured by the nuclear weapons buildup has been poor people, indigenous people. And so we need to get that message across, and we need to be supportive to other groups that are working with these populations in order for us to be effective.
So in response to Savina's letting us know that her two colleagues will have to leave early, I have a question for them, and anybody can join this conversation. I am one of those people that struggles with despair and burnout, from looking at these hard existential threats. And I have found life-giving resources from when I've gone to report on the people down in the Cancer Alley in lower Mississippi that are fighting the gas industries that are there, and also the pipeline fights, because there is, yes, that frontline phenomenon. It is existential threat for them, the extraction of gas that is affecting us all ultimately. But there's a profound assertion of the value of human life. And I think that's what existential threats are implying, that life is not valuable. And to be with people who assert that has revived me. But how do you, Dr. Campbell, working on gun violence, keep up that energy against very persistent violence?
You're muted.
Jack, go lie down.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. And as we know, existential crisis can strike anywhere, or can be the product of much anguish. And that's what my community has endeavored. I've been working in the community for 40 years. And I just want to say these few words. Our children are America's only natural resource. And that's what has made me for 40 years work in my community. And I haven't got tired. In fact, that's why I joined the movement, Poor People's Campaign. Since I've done 40 years in ministry, I'm going to take my next few years and go into the Poor People's Campaign and do what I need to do. Because I got a few more years left after 2 heart attacks and 2 strokes. I have a few more years left. And that's why I came on this side. And I concur with our dear co-chair, Dr. Martin. Will you stand with us? Thank you.
And Janice, did you want to add something?
Yes. I see in the chat that why people are acting with the crisis of George Floyd, of all what's going on. As a minority, as somebody whose parents came from Puerto Rico, I'm African American, like Spaniard Indian as well. Living in poverty, living in the projects, we get disrespected a lot. People might not understand what it is, but we African Americans get disrespected, and as we speak or we say things, we get what do you call it? They get twisted. The words get twisted and misunderstood. We might sound sometimes loud. Our voices go loud sometimes, and people don't understand that. And this is what's going on. A lot of with the gun violence and stuff with our children, especially our Black and brown children, and living in poverty. It's enough. I've seen enough. I've seen it since I was a little girl. I've been an activist since I was 3 years old with my mom. I come from a military family as well. So being in the public schools in Worcester and seeing what I had to go through, it's tough. I was in a school where it was only Caucasian people, only Caucasian students. One of my mom's friend told her, I'm gonna put her there. My mom's like, no, she's gonna suffer. Yeah, I got bullied and everything because I was of color, but you know what? The principal wanted some more minorities in there. Why? Because Janice didn't have friends at playtime. Janice go and clean the yard, or she see a paper and she'll pick it up and stuff. Why? Because I wasn't wanted. I wasn't wanted because I was of color.
Well, Janice,
Okay.
I have to interrupt you there, but don't mean to interrupt you there. You are wanted here in this space. And see, this is what we deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And we have to, work together to come up with some concrete solutions so we can lift our class out of this struggle and into enjoying the benefits that everyone else enjoys.
Yeah,
that
that's
are
what I
not
was. That's what I was
beneath
coming.
the-
That's what I was coming.
Look, we've got to
So-
leave now.
Yes.
It's getting late.
So I'm gonna
Thank
do.
you all for letting us join you today. We appreciate it so much, but we have to leave. We have to be
Yes.
on time. We are so sorry, but we hope that we can come back.
Yes.
Thank you, Savina. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you, Dr. Campbell.
Bye.
Thank you
for
so much.
joining.
Bye.
All right. Yes, let's stay connected. We have a few more minutes with our two Joes, our two panelists named Joe to take on some questions here. So please, if any others from the audience, I was very interested in, you were starting to touch on burnout, Dr. McCabe. So what has that been for you, or how do people address that? Because that is something, this work is not like repairing bridges where it's concrete, you've done one bridge and it's good.
No, it's a constant struggle, and it's very easy to get burned out in situations where you don't maybe see progress. You're doing lots of work, and the goal that you're striving for is so important. I think I had mentioned that I was going through 4 different areas of literature in my review, and what I was impressed by, people coming at this topic from completely different viewpoints all came up with the same thing. If you can't get involved in a community that is working with you and supporting you in what you're doing, you're going to burn out. You're not going to be able to tolerate it. It's too much. It's too stressful. It's the only way to go. And that's really about the only answer that I have for it.
So to be in community with others. We have a very good question here from John Hess. He notes that people reacted strongly to George Floyd, and they're reacting more and more to the climate, and even the Palestinian rights movement is having greater impact, as well as the gay movements. And is this because there's a threat? Have they been successful, or because there are significant events that animate people? Does that mean we involved in nuclear disarmament need a threat like the Cuban Missile Crisis to bring the issue home to the public? So this is an interesting question from John Hess.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that unfortunately, whether or not the public's attention and the media's attention is turned to our issue is not entirely in our hands. And I think a lot of this kind of longitudinal organizing work is about building the groundwork so that you're ready when all of a sudden some kind of crisis turns public attention towards your topic. I think we had a moment like that in February of 2022 with the Ukraine invasion. I certainly, all of a sudden, I'm always knocking at the door of medical academia, trying to get attention in the medical academy on this topic. And a lot of doors opened at that moment. And I spoke at many events, at the hospital and the medical school that were not, people beforehand were like, nuclear weapons, what? And all of a sudden it was recognized as a public health issue. I think so there's a certain extent to which in organizing you have to be building the boat so that when the wind picks up, you have the sail ready. But I'm hopeful that it's that we can find ways to get attention without really being literally on the brink. I mean, we're already in many ways in a pretty precarious situation, as everyone knows.
So unfortunately, this is all the time we have for large group questions. We're going to go into breakout rooms. We've had some very stimulating observations, building the boat, so that we're ready for those times when an event is an educational opportunity. We've also heard about the value of working in community to sustain ourselves, and deep definitions of what existential threat means for especially our Black, Brown brothers and sisters, and how for them the word is not a word, it's what they're dealing with. So lots to talk about in your breakout rooms, and I believe that Brian is going to be sorting us in that regard. And if you are with a group that doesn't, I'm a designated facilitator. If you do not have a designated facilitator, we're going to trust that you are self-sufficient. And we have about 10 minutes for small group discussion, but be mindful that we'll be checking in what were you hearing from each other. So we could go into our breakout rooms now.
Okay, so I'm going to open them up. And thanks, Claire. Just to let the facilitators know, you will be invited to a breakout room. If people who've agreed to facilitate can just stay in the main room, then we can put you one by one in appropriate rooms. So I'm just going to open them up. So everyone will now get a prompt on your screen. You'll be invited. Here, I can get rid of these spotlights so we can all see each other. Sorry, Joe. Put you on the spot, literally. So if you're not a facilitator, if you are a facilitator, if you could raise your digital hand. Okay. Let's make sure we're not getting all of the people in the same room. So Susan, I'm going to move you to room 6. I think it looks pretty good. Oh, we got Kathy and Louise. Kathy, I'm going to move you to room 2. And now everybody should be able to accept your invitations, and there'll be a facilitator in each room.
So Brian, I can just go into, I just press join.
Yep, and it'll send you to room 3, and I think you'll be the facilitator in there. Yep.